With GitHub Copilot Workspace, I wanted to test how far I could go just making an app without writing any of the code. I created an initial JavaScript app and installed some basic dependencies like Phaser, and then I went through and I started specifying in the issue in great detail the exact expectations that I had for Copilot Workspace to generate the application. So here I'm just creating the header and some score displays for the current score and the high score. So it's quite simple, but it's a lot of UI. So it involved a lot of specification around how big to make the font, what colors to make things, and so on. And here, Copilot's actually defined the constants twice. So I was trying to figure out how to make it get rid of the constants.js since those were defined in the game scene as well. Once it looked like it was all right, I ran the code. And we have a code space running in the background here, so we can quickly preview what we're creating and make changes on the fly too. So here it got the score and the best score a little bit wrong, so I'm just going to fool around real quick and change some of the parameters until they're about in the right positions. Once everything's right, we create a pull request and merge it into the main branch to generate the first chunk of code for this game. I picked 2048 because it's a game and it has enough logic to make it a little tricky, but it's also simple enough that I thought it was an approachable task. So once we create the pull request, we can open it in GitHub and merge it in. One thing I discovered as I was working on this is that if we specify too much in the issue, it gets hard for Copilot to manage everything correctly. So I found I had to break things up into a few small parts. So here we'll add a little bit more functionality, but not a ton. And there's a real fine balance between how much I could throw at the AI at once. And then also, if I let it create too much on its own, sometimes it might go off in a strange direction. So it's kind of important as a developer to then go in and say, hey, this is ridiculous, you need to change this. And there are a few examples in this demonstration that'll come up later. So here we've specified a few tweaks to the header and the score, and then we're adding a new game button. And when we mouse over, it's got a little hover effect. It looks pretty cool. So we can merge that in and then move on to the next step, which will be generating the board for the game. And we'll have to define the variables such as the board itself, which will be an array, and a score and high score and so on. One thing that's always a challenge with AI is that people kind of expect magic from it, but when you're using AI, you have to give it enough detail and specificity that it knows what you're expecting. So if I had just said, create a game, who knows what I'd get. And I feel like if I had just told it to go out and create 2048, maybe it would have come back. But I was trying to find, again, that balance between just asking it to make something and seeing what it threw back at me, and kind of breaking the work up into the steps or the specifications, and then running that as we go. So here I'm testing adding I'm adding a random tile to the board. But it doesn't actually draw the number yet. So when we actually update the board, we'll fix that. And at this point, there's actually kind of a huge flaw in the code that caused me a little bit of pain later on, as will become evident. But sometimes the AI does some funny things. You really need to be keeping an eye on it. Here it's creating the board container inside of a function. It's not saving it so that we can access it later, which will come back to bite us. Here I'm trying to define how to update it, so making sure that the tiles have the right background color, and so on. And here I still haven't noticed that here we see an update board. We've created a second board container, which is absolutely not what we want to do. So eventually we'll come back and fix that. And what we can do here is we can kind of go in and change the numbers to, make sure it draws other numbers and they're the right colors. And here I'm searching for the logic to add another tile, which I keep scrolling by. But once I realize it, I'll add it in. It's right above there on line 105 is what I need to do. Here it refreshed real quick. It should have been 16, not 12, so it shows a red background. Once we put everything back, we can create another PR, merge it into main, and move on to the next step. This is a real quick edit just to animate the tile a little bit when the tile is created. There's a few challenges with the approach that the AI decided to go with. So here I'm reviewing it and trying to figure out, what I need to change and how to tell Copilot Workspace to update things. So when we create the tiles, when we want to animate it, we don't want to do it inside of the create tile logic. So I'm telling it to move that logic to a different line. So here we click the new button, and every time as the tile gets created, it animates in. I kept forgetting to click the fix issue thing until after I clicked create pull request and had to change it after in the PR quite a few times. Another thing I'd noticed is that when it created the tile container, it was applying the name of the tile to the text and not the container. So I had to tell it to fix that little bug, and that's what's happening here. So here it's changing the name on the container instead of the tile text. And when it updates it, then it's going to need to account for that, and it didn't do that yet based on the issue. And it still works, so it looks like we're in business. We'll add a few extra dummy tiles just to make sure that when we call the update function, it's working correctly. At this point, though, I haven't realized that the container is getting created on every update as a new object, and we're not updating the existing things. So I'm having a little trouble in debugging here, and I'm quite confused why I'm not seeing what I expect to see. And then to confuse me a bit more, when I updated or refreshed things and commented out the other one, I saw the correct stuff, but yeah. Here I am opening up a code space to try to debug it more, because I still haven't figured out that the container is just not declared when I initialize the class. Since the purpose of the issue is just to fix the naming mistake and move the name to the container, I decided to create the pull request and merge it. And then I created a new issue because I had figured out what the problem was and just said, hey, you need to change where you define this. And then Copilot Workspace went through and made the change. So here we're trying to have Copilot implement all of the logic for the game, figuring out how to phrase the issue in a way where it could generate all of the logic was one of the most challenging parts of this project. Eventually I figured out that kind of loosely defining the rules and then providing examples provided me with the best result. So that's what we have here. When I tried to give too much detail in the writing or not enough detail, sometimes Copilot would be like, here's where your code should go. And I was like, well, I kind of want the AI to generate the code. I don't want to write it myself. That's the whole point of this. So I ended up editing the issue and adding those some examples in, and it worked quite well. So here, as I push the arrows around, the cells are merging and moving to one side. Probably be easier to understand if they were animated, but they're not. Maybe that's another enhancement to make later. So this is where I'm adding the game over screen. There was a problem with the logic it generated where if none of the tiles moved, it wouldn't add a new tile, which never let us get to the actual end game state. So I had a message for it telling it, hey, it's very important you update this logic, but here we can see it didn't update that logic. So I'm going to copy and paste my command from the issue after I check the rest of the code. But here I'm probably tapping the down arrow and stuff, and it's not adding any more tiles. So I go back and I say, hey, you forgot this important logic update. And the code it's generated here is kind of nonsensical. If you were human, you would just delete the if statement, but here it tried to create an else statement with identical logic, so it's kind of another example of why you need a human in the loop still, even when you're using AI, because it's never well, I shouldn't say never, but it's not perfect right now. And it still requires your ability to kind of understand and read and know what's going on in the program. So now we have a functional game. If you consider a game you can lose that functional, where we get the game over screen. I really like how the AI took the button activity and scaling up the button when you mouse over it, like it had on the other one, which I thought was really cool, that it could deduce that we would want to keep that level of consistency across the different user controls. So the last bit of code to add in is the win condition and the win screen. So I'm just adding in a couple of extra tiles from the start so you can easily trigger the win condition to test it out. And it looks good. The only thing is I wanted it to center the you win text on the board and not in the center of the screen. So I decided just to manually push it down a couple of pixels. And that looks about perfect. In about 30 minutes, GitHub Copilot Workspace has generated the game 2048 for me. Of course, it took me more time than that to generate all of the issues to generate that code, but it worked.